My name is Chris Morrison. I'm Chief Marketing Officer with TraceOne, and with me is Julien Mazerolle, who's our VP of Engineering. Today we're going to talk about tracing the world's food from farm to fork. We are an enterprise software company. We produce applications for the retail and consumer packaged good industry. And what we're going to talk about today is how we're using Neo4j inside of our application to power what we're doing with our large customers. What we wanted to talk about was the food supply chain. And all of us as consumers get bombarded on a daily basis with news about the food supply chain. The supply chain for food has gotten far more complex in recent years. We see far more incidents of food recalls and food fraud. And part of this is if you think about the average supply chain, it can be anywhere between 5 and 12 levels deep in terms of suppliers. So oftentimes we think about the primary manufacturer, but in many cases it can go to the supplier, 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 and most companies only have visibility to perhaps 1 or 2 layers in their supply chain. So some of the incidents that we see in the news on a daily basis, we see a lot around food safety. So the two we have mentioned here, salmonella in tomatoes and peppers, 1,500 sick throughout the US and Canada with a $250 million recall associated with it. E. coli in cookie dough, 70 people sick, 25 hospitalized, withdrawal of 86 million cookies worth $300 million. We have food fraud. Just last week, there was an instance of horse meat being pawned off as hamburger or as beef in Florida. And we've seen this incident happen over and over and over again. One of the earlier presentations talked about how the rising middle class is demanding more and more in terms of proteins, and so we're seeing more of these incidents happen. Just recently, a few weeks ago, the first CEO of a peanut manufacturer was put in jail for 28 years for knowingly shipping salmonella-tainted peanuts. And finally, a recent study by the BBC showed that 25% of all oregano shipped is actually different products, not oregano. So we're seeing this news happen all the time. This is a big problem. It's impacting us as consumers. It's impacting us financially. It's impacting our health. And so as TraceOne, we want to go after this problem and help resolve it. We've been working in the food industry for about 15 years. We work with many of the largest retailers and brands out there. We have 20,000 companies that use our platform globally. We have users in 100 countries, and we have about $300 billion a year in spend that's transacted on our platform. So from our perspective, we think that this is a huge problem to go after. Where we've always focused is on that interaction between the retailer and the manufacturer. What we want to do with our new application is be able to map completely from farm to fork, as we say, and use that information to create a healthier and safer supply chain. So when you look at all these incidents that are happening out there, what do we as consumers feel about that? We recently did a study of, we like to do our own homework on these things, and we just recently did a study of 3,000 global consumers in the US, Canada, Western Europe, and Brazil. And we wanted to poll them to understand how they feel about food safety and food quality. And we were a bit surprised about what we saw. One of the statistics here that 12% and 10% respectively of consumers felt that they wholeheartedly trust the safety and the quality of their food. What that means is 9 out of 10 of us here in the room are a little nervous about what we're eating, right? And consumers want more information. I mean, all of us are looking for more information about the food that we eat. We are looking for more information about where the food's produced, about how it's produced, what the ingredients are. And so another statistic that we saw was 91% of consumers say it's important for them to know where their food comes from, but nearly 2/3 say that they're not provided enough information about the food supply chain. And 27% of them don't even believe the labels that are obviously highly regulated by governments in all these respective countries. They don't even believe the labels that are out there as well. So again, this is a big problem. This is a big problem for us as consumers. It's a big problem financially as well. But there's some good news in this for all of our customers out there, is that more information actually helps drive trust. More than 1/3 of the consumers that we polled said that they would actually be willing to pay more for better information about the food that they're consuming. And so if you look at the rise of companies like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's and others that go a very long way about providing information about the food that they have, we know this to be true. And we're seeing this on a global basis. What was interesting is that the statistics were not very much different between France, the US, Brazil, Spain. It was a very consistent global challenge that we're seeing, and that's what we're going after from an application perspective. So we wanted to play just a quick video to reinforce this point, and then we'll get into the technology that we're using.
Consumers are savvier and more curious than ever about the products they buy. They want to make purchases that are in line with their values. They want to know the products they buy are made in an ethical way. Is the farm certified organic? What country did that beef come from? Does that factory comply with food laws and regulations? More importantly, is that product safe to eat? We are all consumers, and we care about the products we buy. We want to trust the brands we buy from. We want to believe labels, keep our families healthy, and shop with confidence. With today's massive global economy, farm-to-fork supply chains can be very complex and involve multiple production facilities at each stage. Brand owners are challenged to gain visibility, or transparency, into those complicated networks to validate data and ensure product safety. SGS Supply Chain Solution, powered by TraceOne, is the world's first B2B social network for retailers, manufacturers, and suppliers. TraceOne's cloud-based technology, together with SGS supply chain expertise, will span the globe and build the largest and most engaging network of retailers, manufacturers, and suppliers. Using the SGS supply chain solution powered by TraceOne means knowing who all of your supply chain partners are and how they may impact your business. It means communicating effectively and securely with all of those partners. It means having immediate access to all facility and partner compliance and audit documentation. It means knowing how and where all of your raw ingredients are sourced. This transparency technology results in better consumer information, leading to stronger consumer trust. Proactively reduce risk while simultaneously empowering your customers to shop with greater confidence.
Good, so hopefully that gives a little bit more context on what we're actually doing here with this solution. And as we said, we've launched this about 6 months ago. The name of the solution is Transparency One, which we're saying is the first B2B social network for supply chain transparency. And just to give a very quick snapshot on the problem and how we're solving it. If you look at just to mention too, one thing that's very important about this is that there's certainly the technology, but from our perspective, this is something that needs to be an industry-adopted solution. And so we're also working with many of the big partners, both influencers in the industry and also large companies like SGS, which is the world's leading testing and auditing company for products, to help bring this solution to market. So we see it certainly as a technology, but also it needs to be something that's adopted as an industry solution. So we're working holistically on that as part of our go-to-market. So just in terms of getting down into the meat of this, so if you look at transparency, the image on the left is really what we would consider a very standard supply chain. So if you look at any product, there's the end product that we all know. There's oftentimes a first level of manufacturers doing the final processing, packaging, but then the supply chain can become extremely complex. It can go down anywhere from 3 levels, if you think about basic ingredients, down to 12 or 14 levels deep in terms of the number of levels of supply chain all working together to bring a product to market. But what's most critical at each one of these steps, and what most companies do not have visibility to across this, is who are all the suppliers, what are all the ingredients in the products, what are the country of origins of all the different components of the product, and also extremely importantly is, were the facilities where these products were made audited and certified for global food safety standards? Oftentimes, companies have visibility on that first or second level. You get down to the third, the fourth, and the fifth, and it becomes very difficult. And so as you look at that image, it's a network. It looks like a graph. And so for us, we realized after a few attempts of doing this on relational databases that we needed to take a different standard from a technology perspective. So on one side, we provide the visibility to be able to look down the supply chain, to be able to map all these connections, to know all these nodes, to understand what's happening, and that's obviously very important. What's more powerful is the ability to look back up the supply chain, or the search side. One of the early conversations we had on this was with a company that was trying to determine, in a potential recall situation of fish produced in a certain factory during a certain time frame, were they at exposure for that particular product, and where did that product go into all of their finished goods? So now they're having to track a raw ingredient from a particular country during a particular time frame and trying to figure out where did that product show up in all of their finished packaged goods. It took them 3 weeks to do that analysis. They had to dig through 17 different systems, and this was something that was a potential recall that could have impacted people. With the technology that we now have in front of us, that can happen in a matter of seconds. And so when you look at the potential for being able to reduce risk in the industry, reduce risk around food, it's limitless with this. And so we feel like we've got an opportunity here to be able to completely transform the way that we're looking at the supply chains in food. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Julien Mazerolle, who's going to walk through the technical challenges that we've faced.
Thank you very much, Chris. In fact, the technical challenge is a big one, but as you know, we are in a graph seminar, so I'm going to talk about graphs. However, when you look at supply chain transparency challenge, you can say, if I just look at a recipe, a standard recipe of a pizza, it can seem fairly straightforward. And if I just want to manage two-tier supply chain, that's easy because you can do that in any SQL database. It's well suited to handle two levels. And if I have to make queries on this, for example, what are the products that contain mozzarella, and I limit it to two levels, it's fairly simple. However, unfortunately, real supply chains are not as simple as you can see in the previous slide. In fact, when you look at the pizza, I take exactly the same example, and it's made of dough, tomato sauce, mozzarella. Then the dough has different suppliers, different ingredients, and I have to look at the next level if I want to know where is the flour coming from. Is it made from wheat, from another cereal? The tomato sauce can have several suppliers and made of tomatoes which come from different origins, from different countries, made with different recipes, and mozzarella, and so on. So in fact, what we face when we want to look at a supply chain, a food supply chain, is what we call a V to the power of 3 challenge. Why is it to the power of 3? Because in fact, you have to combine 3 variable numbers which can change significantly from one supply chain to another. First, you can have a variable number of ingredients at level 1. Here, I took a simple pizza with 3 ingredients, but you can imagine, I don't know, a quattro stagione pizza, which will have 8 or 9 ingredients. Second variable number, the number of levels per ingredient. You have some ingredients which are raw materials, and in that case, you've reached the end of the supply chain, but you have some ingredients which can be fairly complex because made of complex recipe, and even if a tomato sauce can seem simple, for most of you, when you look exactly when a tomato sauce is made, it's fairly complex. It can be with 2 or 3 levels down below, with tomatoes coming from all over the world. So if you want to have full visibility on your tomato sauce, it's also a complexity to factor in. And then at each level, you can have a variable number of suppliers. This is why we call it the V to the power of 3 challenge, because when you combine all these variables and you just multiply one by the other, immediately you see that you are not going to handle millions, hundreds of thousands of nodes, but you are going to handle millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of nodes if you want to map 50,000 or 100,000 products. So it's something which is not obvious if you want to have a full visibility of your product. And I'm just going to take a simple example like the one that Chris mentioned, which is, let's assume that I have a crisis on tomato, and I want to find all products that are in my store or that I manufacture that contain tomatoes. If I want to do that in SQL, it's going to be fairly complex because, in fact, depending on the finished product, you don't know at which level is the tomato. It can be at the first level if it's just a simple tomato salad. It can be at the 5th level if it involves tomato sauce. So when you think about SQL tables and you try to figure that out, you have to make a lot of joins if you want to make this type of query. Plus, tomato can be in intermediate products and maybe not explicitly included. So that's something also pretty complex to query. Then, if you really want to do it, you figure pretty quickly that you need to simulate kind of graph in an SQL database. However, when you talk about food supply chain, one thing that exists is food is not something which is stable. What I mean stable is today I have a given recipe of a pizza. Tomorrow I may have a different recipe of the pizza. In 1 month from today, I have another one, which means that each time you want to run your query on the tomato, you need to make different joins on the table. Now imagine that you have a crisis on tomato in the world and suddenly you have 10,000 users or 100,000 users connecting to the system making exactly the same query. It's going to put a huge workload on an SQL database. And as you've seen in one of the previous presentations, the SQL database is not going to handle this level of query. And third, you can wonder what will be the execution time if you are talking about 1 billion nodes or if you are talking about 10,000 users connecting at the same time. And keep in mind that 1 billion node in the food industry is approximately 200,000 products. And 200,000 products, when you think about what you have in a supermarket, what you have from major CPG company, it's not a huge number. So when we talk about 1 billion nodes, it's quite a standard volume to handle if you want to be fully transparent on the food supply chain. Now, if you do it in Neo4j, you see that you can write the query. I put it in 3 lines just to explain, but for those who are familiar with Cypher, that's probably fairly straightforward. So you can write this query in 1 line. I put it on 3 lines just to split it and to be more clear, but it's in 1 line. You take the products that contains tomato, which is in a recipe, which is considered to be an ingredient, and then you pull out all the finished products which are in the catalog for the company which is named one brand. So what you see here is that in Cypher, you have a language which is suited to this type of query. Then you have all types of optimization which are done in the language that handle this notion of graph database, which is pretty well suited for a food supply chain. And last but not least, it scales really well for more than 1 billion nodes. So for these reasons, TraceOne decided to choose Neo4j to power the Transparency One solution. How does it work? What we did on top of the Neo4j database and on top of Cypher is each member of the supply chain has a private workspace, and this private workspace enables to publish with their customers and to invite their suppliers. So this is a kind of DNA cell in which anybody can publish its information at its level or decide to keep it private. And the notion of keeping it private or deciding to publish it will make the difference between a transparent supplier and a non-transparent supplier. And you see that this module is totally standard wherever you are in the supply chain. There's not this notion of hierarchy where you are on top of the supply chain and you work in a certain way. You're in the middle of the supply chain, you work in another way. You're in the bottom of the supply chain, you work in another way. No. Everybody in the supply chain works exactly the same way with the ability to publish to their customers and to invite their suppliers. And this cell is propagating like a DNA cell and propagates the information either private, and in that case doesn't communicate the information, or public if it's published to the customers. So if you look at the way it works, you see that in a real supply chain, the suppliers are going to be connected to the platform, as the brand owners. Everybody is connected the same way. And what you see here is that the notion of levels in a supply chain, in fact, is completely blurred. Because if you look at the mayonnaise here in the middle of the slide, you can see that the mayonnaise is seen as a level 1 for supplier C, but is seen as level 2 for the supplier who makes ham sandwiches. So with this type of modeling of network, you completely erase the notion of levels, which is in a certain way kind of artificial, and which is also kind of limitation if you think this way of building a supply chain. And what you can see here is that somebody who is level 1 for a given type of product can be level 3 for another type of product, can be level 4 for another type of product. And the power of the graph is being able to handle this flexible notion of levels in the supply chain. And that's something that is possible in a graph, but is not possible in a classical relational database in which you have to declare I am level 2, I am level 3, I am level 4. If you try to do this in an SQL database, which would be the level of the supplier manufacturing mayonnaise? You would need to duplicate it, and in some cases, to have it as a supplier level 1, in other cases as a supplier level 2, and so on. So that would be fairly complicated. In a graph, it's just establishing the connections in the graph, which is being supplier of. So the key concept here is that what you see, as in any social network, is that you are the center of your own network. You are the center of your own transparency. And you see here, I am a supplier of tomato sauce. I have tier 1s, but the big difference between a classical tier 1 supplier and a tier 1 supplier in a graph is that this notion of tier 1 is a local notion. So I am a tier 1 for the tomato sauce supplier, but maybe I will be a tier 3 supplier for another product. So it's like the solar system with the planets, and you are the solar, and you are at the center of your own network, and you can manage your relationships with some planets which are not connected because you haven't established or you haven't sent invitations to these planets. And once you've made the connection, you have a transparency 1 link, which enables you to build connections and exchange information in the graph network. So there's one thing, once you build this, which is really essential in food supply chain. As I mentioned previously, food transparency is something which is dynamic. Recipes are changing, if not on a daily basis, it's on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis. So you are going to say, okay, it's great, I built my food supply chain, but 1 week afterwards, you know, this food supply chain is worth nothing. So what we added on top of the graph is a standard API, which is an industry API, which is defined with the CGF, with SGS, and with all industry stakeholders, which enable to do the real-time update on the information with standard ERP systems like Oracle, SAP, or any other type of system. And this is something which is essential because each time you have a change of recipe in your supply chain, it will be completely updated in Transparency 1. And this is key if you want to be able to respond very efficiently in any food crisis. Suddenly you have a food crisis relative to horse meat in Romania. You need to be able to identify very quickly what are all my products who may contain horse meat from Romania. And then what we measure here related to this continuous update is what is the data freshness. Data freshness is as important as food freshness. You don't eat food which is not fresh. You are not going to accept data which is not fresh. And so we have a mechanism of dashboard which checks on the whole graph what's the data freshness of the information, and then we're able to report it and maybe identify the areas where we need to ask the suppliers at level 3, level 2, relative to the supply chain to update their information because probably their source of tomatoes, their source of flour, their source of wheat has changed since the last update. At the end, what we work for is to improve the trust drivers and to improve consumer trust. And mainly, it's based on 6 pillars. One is the quality process. The quality process is embedded into the solution by all the information related to the ingredients, the suppliers, their certificates. Then we have information on ingredients, raw material specifications, country of origins, which have different implications, because in different countries you may have different regulations, information tracking, label accuracy, and standards for certification and social responsibility. And at the end, that builds and that increases consumer trust. So just to put it in a nutshell, TraceOne manages approximately 300 billion private labels in revenue on a yearly basis, has over 20,000 companies in their base, and is present through suppliers in more than 100 countries. So that was a quick demo. Maybe we have 5 minutes for questions. No? OK. So if you have any questions, you can come back to Chris or myself after the session. OK. Thank you very much.